Okay, so this screencast is going to be about plans for peace and rebuilding. So you can make your outline look like this. This actually will be a short screencast. So we're going to talk about the Yalta Conference, the Nuremberg trials, and the occupation of Japan. We're going to start with the Yalta Conference. So this is where we have the Big Three meeting. This is before the war's over, but the war is near its end, and we have FDR, Stalin, and Churchill meeting at Yalta in 1945. So this is in February of 1945, just 2 months before FDR dies of a stroke. So this is a photo of the Yalta Conference. Joseph Stalin on your far right, in the center is FDR, and on the far left is Winston Churchill. FDR in the middle, you can see, doesn't look very well. So the whole purpose of the Yalta Conference is to discuss what to do when the war is over. That's the entire purpose of the conference. And we have some differences in opinion as to what should happen when the war ends. So Joseph Stalin wants Germany to be occupied after the war, so that the country's never a threat to the Soviet Union again. So he wants it divided into occupation zones. Churchill is going to disagree. He thinks that this will just create more tension, which isn't exactly what we want after this great conflict. So FDR is going to play the mediator and create kind of a compromise. So the compromise is a temporary occupation of Germany. So Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones. These are the decisions that were made at the Yalta Conference. Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones. The western half of the country is split into 3. So the western half is going to be occupied by the French, the British, and the Americans. The French, the British, and the Americans are going to take the western half of Germany, and then the Soviets are going to take the eastern half. And that makes sense, because if you think about geographically where those countries are located, the Soviets are closer to the east, and the French, British, and Americans are closer to the west. So Germany is divided into 4 zones of occupation. The capital of Germany is also going to be divided into 4 zones, just like the country itself. And again, those same 4 countries are going to occupy different zones of the capital. But Berlin, the capital, is located in the Soviet zone. The entire capital is in the Soviet zone of Germany. So that's going to be extremely important in our next lecture on the Cold War. So keep that in mind. So the capital divided into 4 zones, but entirely in the Soviet region of the country of Germany. So there are also continued plans to form the United Nations, which is an international peacekeeping organization, and it's much more effective than the League of Nations. So the United Nations was created based on kind of the idea of the League of Nations, but it was much more successful. And we'll talk more about the United Nations in the next chapter. So we also have Stalin promising to hold free elections in Poland and other Soviet-occupied European countries. And we'll talk about this in the next chapter as well. So these are the 4 decisions that were made at the Yalta Conference. Divided Germany into 4 zones of occupation, divided Berlin into 4 zones of occupation, established the United Nations, and Stalin is promising to hold free elections in Poland and other Soviet-occupied European countries. Okay, and here is a picture of those divisions. So you can see the French, the British, the American, and then the Soviet portion of Germany. And there's Berlin, the capital, up there by Poland. Okay, so, and then that's the capital. That's again divided into 3. So, okay. Next, we're going to talk about the Nuremberg War Trials. So these are the criminal trials for the perpetrators of these death camps and these horrible atrocities that were occurring during World War II. So we have war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. So these are held in Nuremberg, Germany, hence the name, the Nuremberg War Trials. So crimes against humanity, and the definitions, they are all 3 different things. So the definitions are going to be varying. So first we'll start with the definition for war crimes. So war crimes are anything that acts against the customs of warfare, such as the killing of hostages and prisoners, the plundering of private property, and the destruction of towns and cities. So war crimes are, it's kind of confusing because obviously all of those things that we just said seem like they would go with war, but you are typically expected not to kill hostages and not to plunder people's houses, just ordinary civilians' houses, and to completely destroy their towns and cities. So those are war crimes. Crimes against humanity are the murder, extermination, deportation, or enslavement of civilians, and that was the entire purpose of the Holocaust. So they were deported, they were enslaved, and then they were ultimately murdered with the purpose of the extermination of the entire population of those individuals that Hitler did not find favorable. So that's crimes against humanity. Next and last, we have crimes against peace. So crimes against peace are acts of planning and waging an aggressive war. So Hitler wanted to expand his empire as well as exterminate a portion of the country. So that is a crime against peace. Planning and executing an aggressive war, which seems kind of repetitive, aggressive war, but that's crimes against peace. So that's the Nuremberg War Trials. These are held after the war. Last thing we're going to talk about is the occupation of Japan. But first we have to talk about a little bit more about the Nuremberg War Trials. So, sorry, that was like a whole section of my notes. So the judges for the trials are selected from 4 major powers, the U.S., France, England, and the Soviet Union, and they represented the International Military Tribunal. And of the 22 Nazi criminals that were brought to trial, only 12 were sentenced to death. Most of these defendants are just claiming that they were following orders, and those who were directly involved had the most severe sentences. Others who knew of the persecution received small prison sentences or no penalty at all. Honestly, many of them fled the country, and they did not face trial at all. And Hitler, as we know, committed suicide, so there was no Hitler to try, so he escaped trial. Most of the trials focused on Jewish war crimes, but some trials were also held for other war crimes. So we see these Nazis basically just saying that they were following orders. You know, if they hadn't done it, they would have been killed as well. And we can talk about that a little more after the test, just like some interesting parts about that you won't be tested on, but it's interesting. So, like I said, they mostly focused on Jewish war crimes, but some were also held for other war crimes. For example, in Japan, 40 leaders were tried and 7 were sentenced to death, including General Tojo. Also, some questioned Allied behavior during the war was not tried. So some of those things are Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bombs that were dropped, and the massacre in Katyn Forest. So here we see the principle of victor's justice. So Germany's the bad guy. That's how history looks at it. But in reality, the Allied powers did some things that weren't so humanitarian as well. You could look at all of these definitions, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace, and argue that the Allies committed those as well. That's just not how we look at it, because we won the war, and Germany was committing these crimes on a much, much larger scale. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki were actually intended to prevent more death, because remember how we talked about those land invasions were going to result in ridiculous amounts of casualties and civilian death. So I'm not saying that was the right thing to do, but it's just kind of an interesting perspective. So that's something that should be mentioned, that there was some Allied behavior that was questionable. Next and lastly, we're going to talk about the occupation of Japan. So after the war, Japan was occupied by the United States forces under command of General Douglas MacArthur for 7 years. So Douglas MacArthur is the same guy that was in the Philippines. He says, "I shall return." 2 years later, he's back. Now he's in Japan. And MacArthur is going to reshape Japan's economy by introducing free market practices that lead to a remarkable economic recovery. So Japan is just ravaged by this war, and afterwards, in addition to the atomic bombs, their economy is destroyed. So MacArthur is going to work to reshape their economy and introduces these free market practices. He's also going to transform Japan's government by calling for a new constitution that would provide women's suffrage and guarantee basic freedoms. So he's going to work to provide some civil liberties to the Japanese people. People in America followed these changes very closely. There's a quote from the New York Times: "General MacArthur has swept away an autocratic regime by a warrior god and installed in its place a democratic government presided over by a very human emperor and based on the will of the people as expressed in free elections." The Japanese people must have agreed, because their constitution today is still known as the MacArthur Constitution. So that's pretty cool. That's Douglas MacArthur and the occupation of Japan for 7 years after the war. So that is Plans for Peace and Rebuilding.